The daughter-in-law, impatient and cruel, couldn't wait. The urge to confirm the deed brought her back to the forest's edge. But what she found was not the silence of death, but the imposing figure of the tiger, now circling her, not with claws, but with the silent force of primal justice. The fear, the very fear she had wished upon the elderly woman, now enveloped her, a psychological terror that nature in its wisdom had reserved just for her. The forest air, once a silent accomplice to her cruelty, now seemed to vibrate with an ancestral energy, a warning. The daughter-in-law, whose name barely deserved remembrance in the face of the scene's grandeur, felt her blood run cold. It wasn't the night's chill that struck her, but the icy dread emanating from the creature before her. The tiger, a colossus of stripes and muscle, did not roar. It did not attack. It merely circled her, its amber eyes fixed on her, like two incandescent embers in the growing gloom. It was a gaze that promised not a quick death, but an eternity of psychological terror. Every fiber of the woman's body screamed for her to run, but her feet were rooted to the damp forest floor. The smell of wet earth and decaying leaves mingled with the metallic tang of her own fear. She tried to speak, but her throat was dry, a tight knot preventing any sound. The arrogance that had driven her to commit such an atrocity against the elderly woman evaporated, replaced by a vulnerability she never imagined she would feel. The tiger took a slow, almost imperceptible step, yet it resonated like thunder in the daughter-in-law's mind. Its soft paws made barely a sound on the foliage, but with each movement, the ground seemed to tremble. She recoiled a step, then another, but the tiger mirrored her movements, maintaining the exact distance, the circle of dread intact. There was no escape route. The forest, once a backdrop for her crime, now became her prison, and the tiger, her silent executioner. Fragmented memories of the morning flooded her mind. Her mother-in-law's trembling voice, her tear-filled eyes, the pleas muffled by the ropes. The indifference with which she had bound the wrinkled hands, the cruel smile as she left her there for nature to do the dirty work. Now, nature was back, not to fulfill her desires, but to collect. The irony was a poison even more potent than fear. Suddenly, a movement at the periphery of her vision. She blinked, trying to clear the image, and then she saw her, the elderly woman, standing, not bound, not harmed, but there a few feet away, watching her with an expression that was neither triumph nor vengeance, but one of deep, almost pitying sadness. The ropes, the very ones the daughter-in-law had tightened with such force, lay loose at the old woman's feet. How? How was it possible? The answer was there, in the majestic figure that surrounded her. The tiger. It had freed her. The daughter-in-law's terror multiplied. It wasn't just the imminent threat of the predator, but the humiliation of being seen, of being judged by the victim of her own wickedness. The elderly woman, fragile and defenseless just hours ago, was now a silent witness, a ghost of her conscience. The daughter-in-law felt a shiver run down her spine, a coldness that came not from the environment, but from her soul. The tiger, as if sensing the intensification of the woman's dread, let out a low, guttural growl that vibrated in the air and made the daughter-in-law's chest ache. It wasn't an attacking roar, but a warning, a display of power that made her shrink. Its claws, long and sharp, were retracted, but the mere sight of its enormous paws was enough to paralyze her. She was at its mercy, completely. She attempted a last resort, a desperate attempt to bargain with the impossible. "Please." Her voice emerged as a hoarse whisper, almost inaudible. I didn't mean to." The words died in her throat. To whom was she speaking? To the tiger? To the elderly woman? To herself? There was no forgiveness here, only the relentless law of the jungle she had invoked. The tiger took another step, this time a little faster, and the daughter-in-law felt the ground give way beneath her feet. She fell to her knees, hands instinctively raised in a futile gesture of supplication. The animal stopped mere inches from her, its enormous head hovering over hers, its hot, wild breath on her face. Its amber eyes, once merely observant, now seemed to penetrate her soul, stripping bare every lie, every cruelty. The forest's silence was deafening, broken only by the frantic pounding of her own heart. She was trapped, not just by the tiger, but by the web of her own choices, and the predator, in its primal wisdom, seemed to know exactly what to do with her. The world shrank to a point, a tight circle of terror where only the tiger's hot, wild breath existed. The smell of raw meat and damp forest invaded her nostrils, mingling with the cold sweat that trickled down her forehead. Her wide eyes couldn't tear away from the vertical pupils that stared back, a golden abyss that seemed to suck away her very essence. Every beat of her heart was a drum of panic, echoing in the oppressive silence of the forest. She felt the cold of the damp ground through her clothes, but it was an insignificant chill compared to the ice that had settled in her soul. Death, which she had planned for the old woman, now hovered over her, not as a quick end, but as prolonged torture, a cruel game orchestrated by nature itself. The image of the elderly woman, standing unharmed, was an even more terrifying ghost than the tiger. That look of sadness, almost compassion, was a mirror reflecting all her depravity. There was no anger, no vengeance in her mother-in-law's eyes, only a deep sorrow that made her feel even smaller, viler. It was as if the entire forest was witnessing her judgment, and the elderly woman was the silent accuser, the personification of the innocence she had tried to destroy. The daughter-in-law tried to lift her head, to plead, but the words dissolved into a mute lament. Her voice had been stolen by fear, her dignity crushed by the predator's imposing presence and the victim's unwavering gaze. The tiger, as if reading her innermost thoughts, slowly moved its head, a gesture that seemed to carry the weight of ages. Its whiskers brushed the air, almost touching her face, and the daughter-in-law trembled, feeling the vibration of contained power. There was no explicit aggression, but an unquestionable authority, an ancestral wisdom that transcended mere hunting. It was not there to sate hunger, but to impose a lesson, to rebalance the scales she had tipped with her cruelty. A low sound escaped its throat, not a menacing growl, but a deep murmur, almost a warning that seemed to vibrate in her bones. It was the voice of the forest, the voice of wild justice. The daughter-in-law's mind spun in a whirlwind of regret and despair. The house, the money, the freedom she so coveted, all seemed so trivial now, so insignificant in the face of her own imminent end. She saw herself again in the kitchen, preparing tea with an extra dose of sleeping draught, the perverse satisfaction of watching the old woman fall asleep. She remembered the weight of the frail body as she dragged it to the car, the haste in tying her up, the certainty that no one would ever find her. The forest, which once seemed a silent accomplice, was now a relentless judge. Every leaf, every branch, every shadow seemed to whisper her guilt, amplifying her torment. The air grew denser, heavier, as if the very atmosphere was saturated with her fear and the expectation of what was to come. The elderly woman, a silent witness, offered no solace. Her gaze, once pleading, was now chillingly clear, as if the pain she had endured had purified her vision, allowing her to see the daughter-in-law's soul in its total nakedness. There was no triumph, not even the satisfaction of vengeance, only a deep, almost pitying sadness for the ruin the daughter-in-law had built for herself. It was a burden heavier than any verbal accusation, a judgment the daughter-in-law could not refute. The old woman didn't need to speak. Her mere presence, her miraculous survival, was the most eloquent of sentences. The tiger, for an instant, shifted its gaze from the daughter-in-law to the elderly woman as if seeking approval, or perhaps instruction. The connection between the two was palpable, an improbable alliance forged in adversity. The daughter-in-law felt even more isolated, an intruder in a drama she herself had initiated, but of which she was now merely a pawn, at the mercy of forces she did not comprehend. Time stretched, transforming seconds into eternities. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, but the beauty of the scene was overshadowed by the terror that consumed her. The approaching night's shadows seemed to envelop everyone, making the setting even more somber and menacing. The tiger then did something unexpected. Without averting its gaze from the daughter-in-law, it raised one of its forepaws, claws still retracted, and gently placed it on the woman's shoulder. There was no force, no pressure, just the massive weight and rough texture of its paw. It was a touch that promised no injury, but one that sealed her fate, an invisible mark of her helplessness. The daughter-in-law gasped, air trapped in her lungs. The tiger's scent became even more intense, filling every inch of her being. She could feel the animal's body heat through her clothes, the vibration of its muscles beneath the striped skin. It was an intimate and terrifying contact, a proximity that drove her to the brink of madness. Every fiber of her body screaming for her to flee, but the touch of the tiger's paw held her more firmly than any rope. It was a psychological prison, a sentence imposed by nature, and the judgment was only just beginning. The forest, with its nocturnal sounds beginning to emerge, seemed to close in further, transforming into a labyrinth with no exit, where every shadow danced with the promise of an uncertain fate. The distant cry of a nightbird sounded like a lament, a premonition that the night would bring not oblivion, but the intensification of her nightmare. The daughter-in-law, prostrate, felt the damp ground beneath her knees, the cold penetrating her bones, but the true ice came from within. Her wide eyes couldn't tear away from the vertical pupils that stared back, a golden abyss that seemed to suck away her very essence. The elderly woman, a few feet away, remained motionless. Her gaze, once pleading, was now chillingly clear, as if the pain she had endured had purified her vision, allowing her to see the daughter-in-law's soul in its total nakedness. There was no triumph, not even the satisfaction of vengeance, only a deep, almost pitying sadness for the ruin the daughter-in-law had built for herself. It was a burden heavier than any verbal accusation, a judgment the daughter-in-law could not refute. The old woman didn't need to speak. Her mere presence, her miraculous survival, was the most eloquent of sentences. The tiger, for an instant, shifted its gaze from the daughter-in-law to the elderly woman, as if seeking approval or perhaps instruction. The connection between the two was palpable, an improbable alliance forged in adversity. The daughter-in-law felt even more isolated, an intruder in a drama she herself had initiated, but of which she was now merely a pawn, at the mercy of forces she did not comprehend. Time stretched, transforming seconds into eternities. The sun had already set completely, and the darkness of night swallowed the last colors of twilight. Shadows deepened, distorting the familiar shapes of the trees, transforming them into silent monsters. The air grew denser, heavier, saturated with the daughter-in-law's fear and the expectation of what was to come. Then the tiger moved its paw, not to harm, but to push, a gentle yet irresistible shove that made the daughter-in-law stumble sideways. She tried to resist, but the animal's strength was unyielding. She fell to her side, her hands sinking into the damp earth and leaves. The tiger removed its paw from her shoulder and with a slow, deliberate movement, placed it on the ground right beside her head. It was not a gesture of attack, but of absolute control. The daughter-in-law felt the ground vibrate with the animal's weight. Her eyes moved, trying to focus, but the growing darkness and panic prevented her from seeing clearly. A low growl, almost a deep purr, vibrated in the tiger's chest, reverberating through the daughter-in-law's body. It was not a sound of fury, but of warning, of possession. It would not kill her quickly. It would make her feel. The daughter-in-law, pinned beneath the tiger's paw, felt like an insect, insignificant and at its mercy. The forest, now completely dark, seemed to breathe around her, every rustle of leaves, every distant sound, amplifying her torment. She looked at the elderly woman again, seeking any sign of pity, of intervention. But the old woman was there, a serene silhouette against the darkness, watching. Her eyes, even in the gloom, seemed to shine with a light of their own, an ancestral wisdom the daughter-in-law had never noticed before. It was as if the elderly woman had transformed, not into a victim, but into a guardian, a manifestation of the forest itself. The tiger then did something even more disturbing. It lowered its head, and its enormous muzzle approached the daughter-in-law's face. The hot, damp breath with its wild scent enveloped her completely. She could feel the whiskers brushing her skin, the cold, wet tip of the animal's nose almost touching hers. There were no exposed teeth, no explicit aggression, but the proximity was unbearable. A psychological torture that pushed her to the limit. She squeezed her eyes shut, expecting the impact, the end, but it didn't come. Only the hot breath, the scent, the overwhelming presence. The daughter-in-law then realized the tiger was not killing her. It was breaking her mind, her will, her arrogance. It was forcing her to confront the fragility of the life she had scorned, the brutality of the nature she had tried to manipulate. And the elderly woman, the victim who refused to be a victim, was the silent witness to her judgment. The terror was no longer imminent death, but the uncertainty of a fate that seemed much worse. Night had fallen, and with it the true face of wild justice. The daughter-in-law, with her eyes closed, felt the world shrink to the size of that giant muzzle. The tiger's breath, dense and hot, was not just air. It was the scent of the forest in its purest, wildest form, a mixture of earth, blood, and untamed life that invaded her lungs, saturated her senses. Every fiber of her being screamed for her to dissolve, to disappear. But the animal's presence was an anchor of terror that bound her to the most brutal reality. She could feel the vibration of the whiskers brushing her skin, the cold, damp tip of the tiger's nose almost touching hers. There was no physical pain, but the psychological torture was excruciating, an invisible blade slicing her sanity into thin pieces. The daughter-in-law's mind, once so focused on plans and ambitions, was now a chaotic battlefield. Fragmented images of her life flashed by. The house she so desired, the elderly woman's jewels she already imagined on her fingers, the freedom she thought the old woman's death would bring her. Everything seemed so pathetic, so empty now. What was a house in the face of being undone, not by claws, but by fear? What was wealth when life itself hung by an invisible thread, manipulated by a creature that knew no human currency? She opened her eyes, a desperate reflex, and met the tiger's golden eyes inches from her own. There was no explicit rage, nor the blind fury of a hungry predator, but a cold, calculating intelligence, a gaze that seemed to penetrate her soul, stripping bare every lie, every cruelty. It was the gaze of an ancestral judge who saw beyond appearances, who understood the essence of her crime. And in that gaze, the daughter-in-law saw not just her death, but the complete and utter irrelevance of her existence. The tiger then made a subtle movement, not an attack, but a gesture that chilled her to the bone. It moved its head slightly, and the tip of its rough tongue brushed the daughter-in-law's cheek. It was not a lick of affection, nor of cleansing, but a dry, coarse touch that seemed to tear away a layer of her skin, not physically, but spiritually. It was a gesture of possession, of dominance, of a superior being marking its prey, not to devour her, but to humiliate her, to show her how insignificant she was. A moan escaped the daughter-in-law's lips, a hoarse, animalistic sound she barely recognized as her own. Tears, hot and abundant, streamed down her face, mixing with the dirt and sweat, and perhaps with the tiger's saliva. She was not crying from sadness, but from pure dread, from a total and absolute surrender. Her body trembled uncontrollably, a spasm of terror that consumed her completely. The elderly woman, a few feet away, remained motionless, a statue of dignity and resilience. Her eyes, once pleading, now shone in the darkness with a light of their own, a wisdom that seemed to transcend time. The daughter-in-law looked at her, seeking any sign of pity, of intervention, but there was nothing beyond a deep, almost pitying sadness. The old woman needed no vengeance. The forest and its creatures were already administering justice. She was the witness, the survivor, the personification of the strength the daughter-in-law had underestimated. The tiger, for an instant, shifted its gaze from the daughter-in-law to the elderly woman, almost as if seeking confirmation, a silent approval. The connection between the two was undeniable, an improbable alliance forged in adversity. The daughter-in-law felt even more isolated, an intruder in a drama she herself had initiated, but of which she was now merely a pawn, at the mercy of forces she did not comprehend. The forest, with its nocturnal sounds, seemed to close in further, transforming into a labyrinth with no exit. The rustling of leaves, the distant cry of a night bird, the buzzing of invisible insects, everything transformed into a symphony of terror, amplifying the daughter-in-law's despair. Shadows danced with the promise of an uncertain fate, and the air, once dense with her fear, now seemed to vibrate with the expectation of what was to come. The tiger withdrew its muzzle from the daughter-in-law's face, but its paw still held her captive. Instead of moving away, it lowered its body even further, and a low growl, almost a deep purr, vibrated in its chest, reverberating through the ground and the daughter-in-law's body. It was not a sound of fury, but of warning, of possession. It would not kill her quickly. It would make her feel, it would make her confront the fragility of the life she had scorned, the brutality of the nature she had tried to manipulate. The daughter-in-law then realized the true horror of her situation. The tiger was not just a predator. It was a patient executioner, a master of psychological torture. It did not want her blood, it wanted her soul. It was breaking her piece by piece, stripping her of her arrogance, her humanity, reducing her to a mere terrified animal, at the mercy of a force she could never comprehend or control. Night had fallen, and with it the true face of wild justice, a justice that was slow, relentless, and infinitely more terrifying than death. The judgment was only just beginning, and the daughter-in-law knew, with a cold and paralyzing certainty, that there would be no appeal. The tiger's low growl, more a vibration than an audible sound, continued to resonate through the daughter-in-law's body, a guttural melody of dominance that seemed to penetrate her bones. There was no escape, not even in her thoughts. With each beat of her terrified heart, the forest seemed to conspire, the nocturnal sounds transforming into accusatory whispers, the rustling of dry leaves under the tiger's weight, the distant croak of a frog, the lament of an owl high in a tree. Everything merged into a macabre symphony celebrating her ruin. The daughter-in-law's mind, once so sharp and calculating, was now a whirlwind of fragmented images. The house she coveted, the assets she imagined inheriting, the freedom she believed the old woman's death would bring her. Everything seemed so futile, so insignificant in the face of the immensity of that wild creature and the relentless justice it represented. What was a house, after all, when the ground beneath her head vibrated with the promise of an uncertain fate? What was wealth, when life itself hung by an invisible thread, manipulated by a force that knew no human currency? She opened her eyes again, a desperate reflex, and met the tiger's golden eyes inches from her own. There was no explicit rage, nor the blind fury of a hungry predator, but a cold, calculating intelligence, a gaze that seemed to penetrate her soul, stripping bare every lie, every cruelty. It was the gaze of an ancestral judge who saw beyond appearances, who understood the essence of her crime. And in that gaze, the daughter-in-law saw not just her death, but the complete and utter irrelevance of her existence. The tiger, with agonizing slowness, moved its head slightly. The tip of its rough tongue brushed the daughter-in-law's cheek again, a dry, coarse touch that seemed to tear away a layer of her skin, not physically but spiritually. It was not a lick of affection, nor of cleansing, but a gesture of possession, of dominance, of a superior being marking its prey, not to devour her, but to humiliate her, to show her how insignificant she was. A moan escaped the daughter-in-law's lips, a hoarse, animalistic sound she barely recognized as her own. Tears, hot and abundant, streamed down her face, mixing with the dirt and sweat and perhaps with the tiger's saliva. She was not crying from sadness, but from pure dread, from a total and absolute surrender. Her body trembled uncontrollably, a spasm of terror that consumed her completely. Suddenly, the tiger moved the paw that held her, not to free her, but for a new kind of torment. It gently pushed her, rolling her onto her side, exposing her vulnerable belly and neck. There was no aggression, just a cold, calculating manipulation, like a cat toying with a mouse before the final blow. The daughter-in-law tried to curl up, but her body wouldn't respond, paralyzed by terror. She was completely at its mercy, a rag doll in the beast's claws. The tiger then stepped back, just one step, but enough for the daughter-in-law to feel the loss of the oppressive weight and the return of a freedom she did not desire. She expected the attack, the pounce, the quick and brutal end, but it didn't come. Instead, the tiger sat on its hind legs, imposing, watching her with those golden eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. It was as if it were giving her a moment to contemplate her insignificance, to savor the terror of uncertainty. The forest, which once seemed a labyrinth, now transformed into a silent amphitheater where she was the sole actress in a horror drama. The cold night air kissed her sweaty skin, and each breath was a painful effort. She could smell the damp earth, the decaying leaves, and the wild, potent scent of the tiger, which now seemed to permeate every cell of her body. She was becoming part of the forest, not as a visitor, but as prey, an element to be reabsorbed by the nature she had disrespected. The elderly woman, still motionless, seemed a mythical figure, a guardian of the forest, her eyes fixed on the daughter-in-law, but without any trace of triumph or vengeance. There was only a deep sadness, an understanding of the tragedy unfolding. It was as if the old woman was watching an inevitable spectacle, a cycle of cause and effect that she could not, nor wished to, interrupt. The tiger then let out a louder growl, a sound that vibrated through the night, silencing the night birds and stopping the insects buzzing. It was not a growl of imminent attack, but a call, a declaration of dominance, and to the daughter-in-law's horror, she heard a response, a distant growl, echoing from the depths of the forest, answering the tiger's call. It was not one, but perhaps two or three. The night had only just begun, and while justice had more than one face, the terror of solitude was replaced by the dread of even more terrifying company. The distant growls, once a solitary echo in the vastness of the forest, now multiplied, responding to the primal call of the tiger watching her. They were not just sounds, they were vibrations that seemed to tear the fabric of the night, penetrating the earth, the air, and finally the daughter-in-law's soul. Each roar was a sentence, each response a hammer striking the board of her fate. She tried to move, a futile reflex of escape, but her body remained paralyzed, a knot of tense muscles and cold bones. The tiger before her, the first, her silent executioner, did not move. It merely raised its head slightly, its pointed ears swiveling to catch the exact direction of the new sounds. There was a kind of pride in its posture, a confirmation that its authority was recognized, that its call had been answered. It was not a solitary hunter, but part of something larger, a collective force now moving in the shadows, converging on the spot where the daughter-in-law lay, an involuntary sacrifice on nature's altar. The growls drew closer, and with them new sounds joined the macabre symphony, the rustling of dry leaves under heavy paws, the snapping of branches, the dragging of massive bodies through dense vegetation. The daughter-in-law squeezed her eyes shut, as if the darkness could protect her from what was to come, but the images were already etched in her mind. Golden eyes gleaming in the gloom, dark stripes blending into the night, the promise of teeth and claws that knew no mercy. She could feel the ground vibrate, no longer just with the guttural purr of the tiger before her, but with the approach of others. The air, already dense with the wild scent of the first predator, now saturated with a new layer of odors, more intense, more numerous. It was the smell of the living, pulsating forest, and of its most feared inhabitants, the smell of death for her. A pair of golden eyes emerged in the darkness, a few feet away to the right of the main tiger, then another to the left, and then a third, more distant, but undeniably present. They were not mere apparitions. They were solid, menacing presences that seemed to materialize from the very fabric of the night. The daughter-in-law was surrounded. The silent amphitheater had transformed into an arena, and she was the sole attraction, the target of multiple hungry gazes, not for food, but for a justice she could not comprehend. The first tiger, her tiger, lowered its head again, a low growl escaping its throat. But this time it was not a warning to the daughter-in-law. It was a sound of communication, a silent greeting to the newcomers. The other tigers responded with equally low growls, almost inaudible, but laden with an intent the daughter-in-law felt to her bones. They were not there for a frenzied attack. They were there to participate in the judgment, to witness, to intensify the torment. The daughter-in-law's mind, already fractured by dread, now disintegrated completely. The images of the house, the money, the easy life she had planned, vanished into smoke. All that remained was the brutal present, the inescapable reality of her insignificance. She was no longer the manipulator, the architect of destinies. She was the prey, the toy, the object of a vengeance that transcended the human. Tears flowed freely, but there was no sound. Her throat was dry, her lungs burned in a futile effort to breathe. She wished to scream, to plead, but no words could escape. It was as if the forest had stolen her voice, leaving her mute before her fate. The elderly woman, a few feet away, watched everything. Her eyes, now fully adapted to the darkness, seemed to reflect the light of the stars, or perhaps the light of an ancestral wisdom. There was no triumph in her gaze, not even satisfaction, only a deep sadness, an understanding of the inevitable cycle of life and death, of cause and effect. She was the silent witness, the personification of the resilience the daughter-in-law had tried to break, and now the living proof of the justice the forest delivered. One of the new tigers, a female perhaps with slightly lighter fur, stepped forward, stopping a few feet from the daughter-in-law. Its golden eyes met the victim's, and for an instant the daughter-in-law felt a pang of something that seemed like curiosity, mixed with cold indifference. There was no hatred, only the assessment of a predator, the analysis of a creature about to become part of the ecosystem. The first tiger, the one that had held her captive, moved again, not to attack her, but to position itself so that the daughter-in-law was completely surrounded, a silent triangle of death. It gently pushed her with its muzzle, rolling her again onto her back, her neck exposed. It was a display of power, a reminder of her absolute vulnerability. The daughter-in-law felt the strong, musky scent of the tigers closer now, almost suffocating. She could hear the heavy breathing of each, the sound of their hearts beating in a slow, powerful rhythm. The night had transformed into a tangible nightmare, and she was at its center, waiting for the final blow that seemed never to come. The torture of uncertainty was crueler than any physical attack. They were not in a hurry. The night was long, and wild justice, with its multiple faces, had all the time in the world to collect its debt. The judgment was complete, but the execution would be slow, and the daughter-in-law knew that every second would be an eternity of dread. The daughter-in-law lay there on her back, her neck exposed to the darkness and the golden eyes that surrounded her. The musky scent of the tigers, once a distant threat, was now a suffocating cloud, filling her lungs with the odor of the jungle and imminent death. She could feel the warm breath of one of them on her skin, a breath that brought no relief, but the promise of an end that refused to come. The night's cold, which once made her tremble, now seemed an insignificant detail compared to the terror that consumed her. Every beat of her heart was a war drum, echoing in her ears, a pulsing reminder that she was still alive, still feeling, still suffering. The three tigers formed a perfect triangle around her. The first, her original executioner, was at her head, its eyes fixed on hers, a cold, calculating intelligence gleaming in the gloom. To her right, the lighter-furred female, with an almost disturbing curiosity, sniffed the air, as if cataloguing every molecule of her fear. And to her left, the third, a massive shadow, watched with a stillness that was more terrifying than any growl. There was no hurry, no uncontrolled fury. There was only relentless patience, the certainty of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to go. The daughter-in-law's mind, already in tatters, struggled to find any trace of hope, any escape route, but there was nothing. The forest had closed its doors, and the tigers were the guardians. She tried to move her fingers, her feet, but her body was rigid, an empty shell of flesh and bone, unable to obey the commands of a panicked brain. Tears streamed down her temples, wetting the damp earth beneath her head. But they were silent tears, without sound, without relief. It was as if the forest itself were absorbing her pain, transforming it into part of its own ancestral melancholy. Suddenly, the female stepped forward, her soft, heavy paw landing inches from the daughter-in-law's face. The claws were retracted, but the daughter-in-law could feel the latent strength, the capacity to tear and destroy contained within that movement. The tigress tilted her head, her whiskers lightly brushing her cheek. It was not an attack, but an inspection, a touch of recognition, as if tasting the air around her, absorbing the flavor of her fear. The daughter-in-law held her breath, her heart beating uncontrollably, waiting for the blow that never came. Each second stretched into an eternity of dread. The first tiger, the silent leader, let out a low growl, almost a purr, but with a depth that vibrated in the daughter-in-law's chest. It was a communication, a command, and the tigress recoiled a step, but not before giving a final sniff to her hair. The hierarchy was clear, the discipline absolute. The daughter-in-law was an object of study, a macabre entertainment before becoming a feast. The elderly woman a few feet away remained motionless, a statue of resilience and pain. Her eyes, which had seen so many seasons, so many lives and deaths, watched the spectacle with a serenity that bordered on the supernatural. There was no joy in her expression, only a deep sadness for the path the daughter-in-law had chosen, for the inevitability of her fall. She was the silent witness to the forest's justice, a justice that was neither swift nor merciful, but just in its brutality, The daughter-in-law, in her delirium of terror, felt the weight of the old woman's gaze, a judgment that was heavier than the weight of the tigers. The third tiger, the most distant, moved, not towards the daughter-in-law, but in a slow, deliberate circle around the group, as if marking territory, sealing the prey's fate. The rustling of leaves under its paws was the only sound breaking the oppressive silence of the night, a sound that seemed to announce the arrival of something even more terrible. The daughter-in-law could feel the earth vibrate beneath her body with each step of the animal, a rhythmic pulsation that aligned with the pounding of her own terrified heart. She closed her eyes again, wishing it all were a nightmare, that she could wake up in her bed, in the house she had coveted. But the smell of the forest, the warm breath of the tigers, the cold of the earth, everything was too real. The images of the house, the money, the luxurious life she had planned had completely disintegrated. There was no future left, only the brutal present, the inescapable reality of her insignificance. She was no longer the manipulator, the architect of destinies. She was the prey, the toy, the object of a vengeance that transcended the human. The main tiger, the one that had pushed her into that vulnerable position, lowered its head even further, its muzzle inches from her neck. The daughter-in-law could feel the rough texture of the animal's tongue, the tip of a canine tooth lightly brushing her skin. There was no bite, no tear, only the touch, the promise, the terror of anticipation. It was a refined torture, a cruelty that only nature in its majestic indifference could conceive. They didn't just want to kill her, they wanted her to know she was dying, to feel every second of her own annihilation. Night advanced, and with it the certainty that the daughter-in-law would not survive. The forest, which she had seen as a mere obstacle, now revealed itself as a relentless judge, a patient executioner. And the tigers, its silent enforcers, were the instruments of a justice that knew no pity, only nature's brutal balance. The judgment was complete, and the execution would be slow, and the daughter-in-law knew that every second would be an eternity of dread, an eternity that seemed to have no end. The eternity of dread stretched, each second a cold needle piercing the daughter-in-law's flesh. The main tiger's warm breath, which before only brushed, now lingered on her neck, a damp, heavy puff carrying the odor of raw meat and wet earth. She could feel the vibration of the animal's vocal cords, a deep purr that was not of contentment, but of a profound and ancestral authority. It was the sound of the forest breathing, of death approaching at a slow and deliberate pace. Her eyes, wide in the darkness, tried to fix on something, anything other than the imminence of her end. But there were only the dancing shadows of leaves, the massive silhouette of the tigers, and in the distance, the motionless figure of the elderly woman. The old woman, in her stillness, was a mirror of the forest itself, ancient, wise, and relentless. There wasn't a hint of satisfaction in her gaze, only the sadness of one who witnesses the inevitability of a tragic fate, a fate the daughter-in-law had woven with her own hands. The daughter-in-law tried to swallow, but her throat was dry, scratchy. Terror had stolen her saliva, her voice, her capacity for any reaction other than pure, paralyzing panic. She wished to scream, to beg for mercy, but the words were trapped, suffocated by a knot of fear in her chest. Her muscles were tense, aching, not from effort, but from the rigidity of dread. Every fiber of her being yearned to flee, to writhe, but her body was pinned to the ground, immobilized not just by the tigers, but by the overwhelming force of the situation itself. The lighter-furred tigress, which had sniffed her before, now approached again, but this time differently. It did not touch the daughter-in-law with its muzzle, but with its paw. An enormous, soft paw that slowly descended onto the daughter-in-law's chest, right above her heart. The claws were retracted, but the weight was undeniable, a pressure that prevented her from breathing fully. The daughter-in-law could feel the warmth of the paw, the rough texture of the skin beneath the fur, and the latent strength contained within that limb. It was not an attack, but a demonstration of power, a reminder that her life lay in the paws of those predators. The daughter-in-law's heart pounded uncontrollably beneath the weight, a frantic drum that seemed ready to burst. The main tiger, her tiger as she had mentally dubbed it in her delirium, let out a more audible growl, a guttural sound that made the earth vibrate. The tigress withdrew its paw, but not before giving a light and calculating shove, making the daughter-in-law feel the impact on her ribs. It was a cruel game, a macabre dance of power and submission. They were not in a hurry. The night was long, and the torture of anticipation was, for them, part of the hunt. The daughter-in-law's mind began to relive moments of her life, not in a farewell flash, but in fragments distorted by terror. The image of the house which she so coveted appeared, but it was no longer a refuge. It was an empty cage, a symbol of her greed that had led her to this hell. The money, the power, everything seemed so insignificant now, so pathetic before the wild majesty that surrounded her. She saw herself tying up the elderly woman, the cruelty in her own eyes, and the image overlaid her own current helplessness. The irony was a poison even more bitter than fear. The third tiger, the one that had circled the group, now positioned itself behind the daughter-in-law's head, completing the encirclement. Its golden eyes gleamed in the darkness, fixed on hers, as if reading her soul, evaluating every sin. The daughter-in-law felt the strong, musky scent of the three animals, a cocktail of savagery that filled her lungs, suffocating her. She was completely surrounded. There was nowhere to go, not even in her mind. The elderly woman a few feet away did not move. Her eyes, which had seen the daughter-in-law grow up, marry her son, and then transform into a monster, now watched the conclusion of a cycle. There was no anger, only a deep and weary resignation. She had forgiven the daughter-in-law in her heart, not out of merit, but for the peace of her own soul. But the forest did not forgive. The forest collected its debts with the currency of life and death. Suddenly, the main tiger moved again, not to attack, but to lie down beside the daughter-in-law, its warm, furry flank pressing against her body. It was an intimate, terrifying proximity. The daughter-in-law could feel the animal's deep breathing, the warmth of its body, the contained strength in every muscle. Its whiskers brushed her hair, and the tip of its tail, thick and powerful, gently tapped the ground. A slow, constant rhythm that was the only sound besides the frantic pounding of her own heart. The daughter-in-law closed her eyes, wishing death would come quickly, that this torment would end. But death was not in a hurry. She was an honored guest, and the forest, in its ancestral wisdom, wanted the daughter-in-law to feel every second of its arrival. The torture of uncertainty was crueler than any physical blow. They didn't just want to kill her. They wanted her to know she was dying, to feel every second of her own annihilation. Night advanced, and with it the certainty that the daughter-in-law would not survive. The forest, which she had seen as a mere obstacle, now revealed itself as a relentless judge, a patient executioner. And the tigers, its silent enforcers, were the instruments of a justice that knew no pity, only nature's brutal balance. The execution would be slow, and the daughter-in-law knew that every second would be an eternity of dread, an eternity that seemed to have no end, and which now, with the tiger's warmth beside her, became even more intimate and unbearable. The daughter-in-law's world had shrunk to the burning heat of the tiger's flank against her. Every breath the massive animal took vibrated through her own body, a deep, resonant rumble that was both terrifying and strangely hypnotic. She could feel the rough texture of its fur, the immense power of the muscles beneath, a living furnace pressed against her. The scent of savagery, of predator, was overwhelming, filling her nostrils, her lungs, becoming the very air she breathed. It was no longer just fear, it was a fusion, an annihilation of her individuality, of her humanity, replaced by the overwhelming presence of the animal. Her closed eyelids offered no sanctuary. The darkness behind them was populated by distorted images, the elderly woman's aged face, no longer pleading, but serene in her condemnation. The house, which now seemed a cold, empty mausoleum, a monument to her own ruin. The face of the son, her husband, whom she had deceived and betrayed, a silent ghost watching her from some distant place. The irony was a poison that corroded her soul. She had planned a life of comfort and control, and now she lay on the cold earth, a toy in the paws of predators, with no control whatsoever, not even over her own body. The tiger beside her moved slightly, an adjustment of weight that made the daughter-in-law hold her breath. Its tail, which before had tapped softly, now rested on her leg, a soft weight, but with the implicit promise of crushing force. She could feel the bristly hairs of the tail brushing her skin, a sensation that was both mundane and terrifying. The other tiger, the one that had sniffed her and touched her with its paw, let out a low meow, almost a purr, but with a note of impatience, of anticipation. It was a sound that seemed to cut the air, a warning that the game was coming to an end. The elderly woman, a few feet away, remained a stone figure. Her eyes, which had witnessed the daughter-in-law's cruelty and now the forest's justice, showed no triumph. There was only the deep sadness of one who sees life unfold in tragedy, the resignation of one who understands that every action has its consequence. She did not wish for the daughter-in-law's death, but accepted its inevitability, as if the forest were correcting an imbalance, restoring an ancestral order. The old woman was the silent witness, the bridge between the human world and the relentless savagery that now dominated the scene. The daughter-in-law, in her delirium of terror, felt the dampness of the earth beneath her body, the smell of moss and decaying leaves. The air was heavy with the presence of the tigers, a wild perfume that mingled with her own cold sweat. Every muscle in her body screamed for movement, for escape, but she was paralyzed, not just by fear, but by the animal's very physical presence. The main tiger, with its warm flank, held her captive, a living anchor of dread. Its teeth, which she imagined every second sinking into her flesh, were a constant threat, invisible yet palpable. Her mind, once so astute and calculating, was now a whirlwind of broken fragments. She saw herself again in the house, planning, manipulating, her voice full of false sweetness as she tied up the old woman. The image of her own hands, the same hands that now trembled uncontrollably, overlaid the vision of the tightened ropes. The cruelty she had inflicted on the elderly woman was now mirrored back to her, amplified by nature's majestic indifference. There was no negotiation, no plea that could change her fate. The third tiger, which was behind her head, moved again. A slow, heavy step that made the earth vibrate. The daughter-in-law felt the shadow of its head over hers, its warm, damp breath brushing her scalp. It was not an attack, but a redefinition of the encirclement, a final adjustment before the ultimate act. It was as if the three were communicating silently, a deadly choreography rehearsed for millennia of hunting and survival. They were the personification of death, not as an abrupt end, but as a process, a slow and inevitable absorption of her life back into the earth. Time had lost its meaning. Seconds stretched into eternities, and the night seemed endless. The daughter-in-law wished for the darkness of unconsciousness, the liberation from the pain of anticipation. But the forest did not allow such mercy. It wanted the daughter-in-law to feel every beat of her heart, every drop of cold sweat, every fiber of her being surrendering to terror. The tiger's warmth beside her, once an intimate torture, now seemed to intensify, a feverish heat consuming her from within. She could feel the blood pulsing in her veins. The sound in her ears was deafening. Suddenly, the main tiger raised its head. There was no growl, no abrupt movement, only the slow, majestic lifting of its head, its golden eyes fixed on the daughter-in-law's closed eyes. It seemed to be waiting, observing, as if giving her a last moment to comprehend the totality of her situation, to accept her fate. The daughter-in-law felt the pressure of the tiger's flank lessen slightly, but the weight of its tail on her leg remained. It was the prelude, the silence before the storm, the moment when the game ended and the brutal reality of the forest asserted itself. The daughter-in-law's breath hitched a hoarse, desperate sound. She knew the end was near. The eternity of dread was about to condense into a single terrible instant. The forest air, once merely cold and damp, now grew dense, heavy with a deadly expectation. The daughter-in-law, with her eyes still tightly shut, felt the absence of the tiger's flank pressure, but the weight of its tail on her leg was a constant reminder, a living anchor that bound her to the reality of her hell. The silence that followed the main tiger's head rising was more deafening than any roar. It was the silence of the final hunt, the moment when the prey, exhausted and resigned, awaited the blow. In her mind, she could see the tiger's golden eyes, even through her closed eyelids, feeling naked, exposed, her soul being weighed and judged. She held her breath, a futile reflex. The musky scent of the tigers seemed to penetrate her bones, impregnating every cell of her body. The pounding of her heart was a frantic drum in her ears, an accelerated rhythm that seemed ready to explode in her chest. She expected the pain, the tearing of flesh, the abrupt end, but it didn't come. Instead, she felt a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. It was not an attack, but an even more intimate approach. The main tiger, head held high, slowly leaned in. The daughter-in-law felt the animal's warm, damp breath brush her face, a wild exhalation carrying the scent of meat and earth. Its thick, sensitive whiskers touched her skin, a strange and chilling sensation that made her shiver. It was an exquisite torture, a cat-and-mouse game where the cat was in no hurry and the mouse had already given up. The tiger didn't just want to kill her, it wanted her to know she was being hunted, to feel every fiber of her being surrender to dread. The daughter-in-law's mind, in its torment, began to project images. She saw herself, young and ambitious, entering that house for the first time, her eyes shining with the promise of a luxurious life. She saw the elderly woman, then vibrant and welcoming, receiving her with affection. The irony was a poison that consumed her from within. She had exchanged kindness for greed, love for cruelty, and now nature was collecting its price. The tiger's breath became more intense, closer. The daughter-in-law felt the tip of the animal's nose touch her forehead, a light touch, yet laden with a primal force. It was a recognition, a final assessment. The other two tigers, completing the encirclement, moved in unison, a slow, synchronized step that made the earth tremble softly. She could feel the vibration through the ground, a premonition that the moment was indeed arriving. One of them let out a low meow, a guttural sound that was not a growl, but a communication, a confirmation. The elderly woman, a few feet away, watched the scene with an almost supernatural stillness. Her eyes, which had shed so many tears for the daughter-in-law's cruelty, were now dry, fixed on the macabre dance unfolding. There was no joy in her expression, only a deep and weary understanding of the forest's relentless justice. She did not wish for the daughter-in-law's death, but understood that nature, unlike humans, did not negotiate with wickedness. It merely restored balance. The old woman was the silent witness, the personification of the ancestral wisdom the daughter-in-law had scorned. For the daughter-in-law, every second was an eternity of dread. The tiger's touch on her forehead, its warm breath, the wild scent, everything intensified, becoming the sole reality. She wished for unconsciousness, the darkness that would free her from that torment. But the forest did not allow such mercy. It wanted the daughter-in-law to feel every beat of her heart, every drop of cold sweat, every fiber of her being surrendering to terror. The tiger's warmth, once an intimate torture, now seemed to intensify, a feverish heat consuming her from within. She could feel the blood pulsing in her veins. The sound in her ears was deafening. Suddenly, the maned tiger slightly moved its head away from her forehead, but its golden eyes, which the daughter-in-law imagined fixed on hers, did not waver. Instead, it let out a deep purr, a sound that vibrated in its chest and resonated through the forest. It was not a purr of contentment, but a sound of power, of dominance, a prelude to what was to come. It was a sound that said, "I am the predator, and you are the prey, and this is your end." The daughter-in-law felt the weight of the tiger's tail on her leg intensify, as if the animal were preparing to rise, to begin the final act. Her entire body trembled uncontrollably, a final spasm of resistance before total surrender. She tried to scream, but no sound escaped her parched throat. The voice she once used to manipulate and deceive was now trapped, silenced by terror. The daughter-in-law's world had shrunk to this moment, to this overwhelming presence of the tigers, to the imminence of her own annihilation. She was the personification of fear, a toy in the paws of predators, and the forest, in its ancestral wisdom, was about to reclaim her. The tiger's purr seemed to echo in her own soul, a wild requiem for her life of cruelty. The end was near, and she knew it would be slow, intimate, and terribly just. The tiger's purr, which before was a wild requiem for her life of cruelty, now transformed into a macabre hymn of dominance, vibrating not only in the daughter-in-law's chest, but in every fiber of the soil beneath her. It was the voice of the forest, the final sentence pronounced by a relentless judge. The weight of the tail on her leg, which before was an anchor of dread, now transformed into a shackle binding her to her execution. She felt the maned tiger's muscles contract, a tension that transmitted to her own body, as if both were connected by an invisible chain of destiny. Her eyes, still tightly shut with desperate force, projected distorted images of her life, the elderly woman's face, once smiling and welcoming, now contorted by the pain of the ropes she herself had tightened, emerged as a silent accusation. The house, her object of desire, and the root of all her wickedness, now seemed a distant ghost, a useless and worthless prize in the face of imminent death. The smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, which before seemed merely the perfume of the forest, was now the odor of her own grave, the scent of absorption. The maned tiger, with a slow and deliberate movement, completely moved its head away from her forehead. But it was not a relief, it was the preparation. The daughter-in-law felt the shadow of the animal's head hovering over her, blocking the little light that filtered through the trees, plunging her into an even deeper darkness. The purr ceased, replaced by an even more terrifying silence, a vacuum of sound that amplified the frantic and deafening pounding of her heart. Every second was an eternity of anticipation. Then the touch came. Not the teeth, not the sharp claws she imagined tearing her flesh, but the paw, an enormous padded paw with retractable claws she knew were there, hidden but ready to be revealed at the right moment. The paw landed gently on her shoulder, a weight that was not of attack, but of possession. It was a gesture of claim, of absolute dominance. The tiger was in no hurry. It wanted her to feel the totality of her insignificance, the futility of her resistance, the inevitability of her fate. The daughter-in-law let out a muffled moan, a sound she didn't even recognize as her own. It was a sound of surrender, of absolute despair, the last manifestation of her will before being completely crushed by terror. The tiger's paw moved slightly, the rough hairs brushing her skin through her clothes. There was no physical pain yet, but the pain of anticipation was excruciating. a psychological torment that consumed her soul, burning her from within. The other two tigers, like statues of golden vigilance, maintained their positions. Their eyes, even if the daughter-in-law didn't see them, she felt them upon her, like laser beams piercing her soul. With each movement of the main tiger, they seemed to adjust minimally, a synchronized ballet of predators awaiting the signal. There was no hurry, no uncontrolled fury, only a cold calm, an unshakable certainty of their power. The daughter-in-law was the centerpiece of an ancient ritual, an offering to wild justice. She was the prey, and they were the hunters, but the hunt was not for quick death, but for the annihilation of hope. The elderly woman, observing from her position, felt the weight of each second. Her eyes, which had witnessed the daughter-in-law's wickedness, now saw the forest collect its price. There was no triumph in her gaze, only a deep understanding of the interconnectedness of all things. Nature, in its wisdom, did not seek vengeance, but balance, and that balance was being restored, millimeter by millimeter, claw by claw. She felt the forest air, once oppressive, now almost purified by the imminence of retribution. The main tiger's claw, after tracing a small circle on her shoulder, moved downward towards her neck, no longer a scratch, but a firmer pressure, as if the animal were testing the resistance of her skin, the fragility of her life. The tiger's warm breath brushed her ear again, and the daughter-in-law felt a chill run down her spine. She could almost hear the predator's unspoken words. "You are mine. Your time is up." Her mind clung to fragmented memories, to moments in her life where the choice to be cruel had been made. Every lie, every manipulation, every act of inhumanity against the elderly woman now presented itself as a ghost, a silent accusation. The house, her object of desire, now seemed a distant mirage, worthless, meaningless. All that mattered was the touch of the claw, the warm breath, the imminence of an end she herself had orchestrated. The main tiger, as if reading her thoughts, let out a new purr, a sound that vibrated in its chest and resonated in her ears. It was not a purr of immediate satisfaction, but of a deep and ancestral patience. The paw on her shoulder with the claw still retracted, but its sharp tip brushing her skin, moved again. This time, a little further down towards her collarbone. The weight of the tail on her leg intensified, as if the animal were anchoring itself, preparing for a more significant, more definitive movement. The daughter-in-law felt sweat trickle down her face, mixing with tears she didn't even know she was shedding. Her body trembled uncontrollably, a final spasm of resistance before total surrender. She wanted to scream, to plead, but her throat was dry, her voice trapped in a knot of terror. The forest, in its wisdom, did not hear pleas. It merely executed justice. The main tiger tilted its head, and the daughter-in-law felt its muzzle brush her neck again, this time a little lower near the base. The wild scent, the damp warmth, everything intensified. The tip of the claw on her shoulder, which before only brushed, now seemed to press slightly, a warning, a promise. She knew the next movement would be the point of no return. The line between psychological torture and physical pain was about to be crossed. The other two tigers, in an almost imperceptible movement, stepped forward, closing the circle even further. The air around the daughter-in-law seemed to thin, each breath an effort. She was the center of a universe of dread, a star about to collapse under overwhelming pressure. The elderly woman with fixed eyes watched the scene. There was no cruelty in her gaze, only the acceptance of inevitability. The daughter-in-law had planted seeds of wickedness, and now she reaped the forest's harvest. The silence was broken only by the frantic pounding of the daughter-in-law's heart, a macabre drum marking the time of her own punishment. The main tiger, with a slow and deliberate movement, removed its paw from her shoulder. For a brief, infinitesimal second, the daughter-in-law felt a flicker of hope, but it was quickly crushed. The tiger did not move away. Instead, it moved, repositioning itself differently. The daughter-in-law felt the weight of the tail on her leg intensify, and then a new touch. No longer the paw on her shoulder, but the tiger's muzzle, now firmer, pressing against the back of her neck, right at the base of her skull. The warm, damp breath, the smell of earth and meat, was now a total invasion. She felt the rough hairs of the muzzle brushing her skin, and then the tip of a fang. Not a bite, but a contact, a final warning, more intimate and terrifying than any claw. It was the promise of an end that would be slow, intimate, and terribly just, exactly as the forest had decreed. The forest's justice was not swift, but relentless, and the daughter-in-law was about to learn its true dimension. The tip of the fang, not a bite, but a contact, a sharp needle of bone, cold and lethal, pressing against the vulnerable skin at the base of her skull. The daughter-in-law felt the world spin, not from vertigo, but from a sudden and overwhelming certainty. It was the end. Not a quick and merciful end, but the end the forest had promised. Slow, intimate, terribly just. The tiger's breath, a mix of earth, blood, and savagery, filled her lungs, suffocating her with the terror itself. Every fiber of her being screamed, but no sound escaped her throat. The fang did not pierce, did not tear. It merely pressed, a constant reminder of the fragility of her existence, of the proximity of annihilation. She felt the muscle in her neck contract involuntarily, a futile spasm against the overwhelming power that enveloped her. Her eyes, still tightly shut, projected distorted images of her life. The house, her object of desire, now seemed a cruel joke, a distant and meaningless dream. The elderly woman's laughter, the kind words she had ignored, the pleas she had crushed, everything echoed in her mind, a chorus of condemnation. The mane tiger, with terrifying precision, moved its head slightly. The tip of the fang slid, not outwards, but sideways, tracing an invisible furrow on her skin. It was a macabre caress, a prelude to the violence that would come. The weight of the tail on her leg intensified, anchoring her, making any attempt at escape a pathetic impossibility. The other two tigers, like golden shadows, maintained their positions, their eyes fixed, mesmerizing, waiting. They were the silent audience to her own judgment. The daughter-in-law felt sweat trickle down her back, an icy river that seemed to wash her soul. The smell of her own fear was so pungent that it seemed to impregnate the air, mixing with the wild aroma of the predators. She was immersed in a symphony of terror, where the only audible sound was the frantic pounding of her heart, a macabre drum marking the final seconds of her life. Each pulsation was a countdown, each beat a farewell. The elderly woman, observing from her position, felt no joy, not even the relief one might expect. Only a deep and melancholic understanding. Nature was not cruel, it was just. The daughter-in-law had sown wickedness, and now she reaped the forest's harvest. Her eyes, once full of pain and despair, now reflected a serene calm, the acceptance of a cycle completing itself. The forest air, once heavy with tension, now seemed to purify, as if the imbalance were being corrected. The mane tiger let out a new purr, deeper, more guttural than any other. It was not a sound of rage, but of power, of absolute dominance. The daughter-in-law felt the vibration in her bones, in her soul. The fang at her nape pressed a little harder, and she felt the skin give way, a slight tear, a trickle of warm blood flowing. It was not a deep wound, but a warning cut, a promise fulfilled. The pain was minimal, but the meaning was colossal. The line had been crossed. In her delirium, the daughter-in-law saw herself as a child, running through fields, innocent, without wickedness. How had she transformed into the cruel creature she was? Ambition, Envy, the desire to possess what was not hers, everything had led her to this moment, to this forest, to this fang at her nape. There was no longer anywhere to run, anywhere to hide. The forest was her judge, her executioner. The maned tiger, with a slow and deliberate movement, withdrew the fang from her nape. The daughter-in-law felt an emptiness, a momentary relief, before dread returned with full force. The animal did not move away. Instead, it leaned in even closer, and the daughter-in-law felt its muzzle brush her neck, this time at the front, near the jugular. The damp warmth, the wild scent, everything intensified. And then she felt it. Not a fang, but the tiger's rough tongue licking the small trickle of blood that flowed from her neck. It was an act of grotesque intimacy, of absolute dominance. The daughter-in-law trembled uncontrollably, a final spasm of horror. The rough tongue, like sandpaper, cleaned the blood, a gesture that was both repulsive and terribly symbolic. She was the prey, and the predator was savoring the first taste of its victory. The other two tigers, in a synchronized movement, took another step forward, closing the circle, their eyes gleaming in the forest's twilight. The maned tiger, after licking the blood, let out a deep sigh, a sound that seemed to come from the depths of the earth. Its muzzle moved away from her neck, but its paw, with claws still retracted but the pressure unmistakable, returned to rest on her shoulder. The weight of the tail on her leg intensified, and the daughter-in-law felt the tiger's body move slightly, adjusting its position. She knew the next movement would be the final one. There would be no more warnings, no more psychological torture. The forest had spoken, and the sentence would be executed. The end, slow and intimate, was there, not as a distant promise, but as a palpable, inescapable reality. The daughter-in-law closed her eyes, not to avoid the sight, but to surrender to the fate she herself had forged. The daughter-in-law closed her eyes, not to avoid the sight, but to surrender to the fate she herself had forged. The weight of the tiger's paw on her shoulder, its tail on her leg, the wild scent that enveloped her. Everything merged into a single, overwhelming sensation of inevitability. She expected the pain, the final bite, the tearing of flesh that would seal her destiny. But the forest, in its ancestral wisdom, did not deliver death in haste. It served it in doses, a macabre feast of dread and anticipation. The silence that followed was not the silence of peace, but the silence that precedes thunder, the calm before the storm. In her mind, the echoes of her life passed like a distorted film. Innocent childhood, ambitious youth, the adult woman consumed by greed. The house, once the apex of her desires, was now just an empty memory, a futile reason for such cruelty. She had traded life, humanity, for bricks and tiles. And now the forest collected the price. The maned tiger, with a movement that seemed both slow and lightning fast, removed its paw from her shoulder. For an instant the air seemed to thin even further, and the daughter-in-law felt an emptiness, an absence that was almost as terrifying as the presence. But it was not a relief. It was the preparation. The animal moved, not to attack directly, but to position itself. The daughter-in-law felt the tiger's muscular body brush her back, an intense heat, a brutal force that made her tremble even more. The tail, once a weight on her leg, now coiled around her, trapping her, making any escape a pathetic illusion. And then the sound. Not a roar, but a deep guttural growl that vibrated in her chest, in her bones, in every cell of her body. It was the sound of nature in its purest, wildest state, the sound of a predator claiming its prey. The other two tigers, like a macabre chorus, responded with lower growls, a crescendo of menace that seemed to close the circle not just around her body, but around her very soul. The daughter-in-law felt the maned tiger's muzzle approach again, this time not at her nape, nor her neck, but at her ear. The warm, damp breath, The smell of earth and meat invaded her senses, suffocating her. She felt the rough hairs of the muzzle brush her skin, and then a pressure. Not a bite, not a claw, but the tip of a fang, cold and sharp, touching the cartilage of her ear. It was a whisper of death, an intimate and terrible promise. In her mind, the elderly woman's words, the ignored pleas, the tears she had caused, everything mingled in a silent lament. The house, the inheritance, the material comfort, everything turned to dust before the imminence of annihilation. She had sought power, control, and now she was the most helpless of creatures, at the mercy of a force that knew no bargaining or pity. The main tiger moved its head slightly, and the daughter-in-law felt the fangs slide, not piercing, but tracing a furrow on the edge of her ear. A trickle of warm blood flowed, mixing with the cold sweat that covered her face. The pain was minimal, almost imperceptible amidst the overwhelming terror, but the meaning was immense. It was the seal of the sentence, the confirmation that the forest's justice had arrived. The elderly woman, with eyes fixed on the scene, felt no triumph, only a deep and melancholic acceptance. The daughter-in-law had chosen her path, and the forest, in its impartiality, merely reflected that choice. The cycle of life and death, of cause and effect, completed itself before her eyes. There was no vengeance, only the execution of a natural law, as ancient as the trees that surrounded them. The main tiger, as if having completed its part of the psychological torture, finally moved slightly away from the daughter-in-law's ear. But it did not move away completely. Instead, the daughter-in-law felt the weight of the paw on her shoulder intensify, and the tiger's body tense. It was the final moment. The air grew heavy, dense, as if the forest itself held its breath. And then, the movement, swift, precise, relentless. There was no time for screams, nor for pleas. The tiger's paw, with claws now extended, descended onto her shoulder with crushing force. At the same time, the animal's body lunged, and the daughter-in-law felt a searing pain, a deep tearing that made her stagger. She did not fall. The other two tigers, in a synchronized movement, sprang forward, not to attack, but to close the circle, to ensure there was no escape. The main tiger, with a roar that echoed through the forest, sank its fangs. It was not a wild, disordered attack, but a surgical, calculated strike aimed at the most vulnerable point, the neck. The daughter-in-law felt life drain from her body in an instant, an electric shock that paralyzed her. Her eyes, which opened in a last spasm of horror, saw only the golden gleam of the tiger's eyes, an abyss of savagery and indifference. The daughter-in-law's body collapsed, not with a dry thud, but with the softness of a falling leaf, without resistance, without life. The forest, which before seemed to hold its breath, let out a collective sigh, a murmur of leaves and wind. Silence returned, but this time it was a silence of conclusion, of a cycle that had reached its end. The three tigers, in an almost ritualistic movement, moved away from the inert body. There was no hunger in their eyes, nor the fury of a hunt. There was only the calm of those who had restored balance. They looked at the daughter-in-law's body for a moment, as if confirming the execution of the sentence, and then, one by one, they turned away. The main tiger, with a final glance at the elderly woman, let out a soft purr, almost a murmur of farewell. There was no longer a threat, only the confirmation that its task was complete. It turned, and the other two followed, disappearing silently among the shadows of the trees, like golden ghosts dissolving into the forest. The elderly woman, still seated, watched the animals depart. The daughter-in-law's body lay on the ground, a dark stain against the damp earth. There was no triumph in her heart, only a deep sadness for the wasted life, for the corrupted soul. But there was also a peace, a serenity that the forest, in its relentless justice, had granted her. She rose, her 80 years weighing on her bones, but with a new strength in her spirit. She looked at the daughter-in-law's body one last time, and then, without a word, turned her back. The house, the object of desire that had led the daughter-in-law to ruin, was now just a place. The elderly woman's true home was the forest, the sanctuary that had protected her, that had restored order. She walked slowly, her steps firm on the soft earth. The sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, and the forest prepared for night. The elderly woman felt no fear. She was home. The forest's justice was not swift, but relentless, and above all it was just. She had survived, she had been a witness, and the forest, in its eternal wisdom, had spoken. The cycle was complete.